In 1998, economists Yuri Gnizi and Aldo Rushdini realized that there was a problem in Israel's private kindergartens. Parents were always late to pick up their children. Daycare centres all over the city always closed at 4 p.m, as everyone knew. However, despite that, practically every single day, some caregiver had to stay after hours working with the child because their parents were late. And yes, I know that this phenomenon probably doesn't even seem very significant or even that unusual, but for researchers, it was a perfect scenario to put into practice one of the experiments that they had in mind. It turns out that Gnizi and Rushdini had long been interested in studying how governments could control the behaviour of their citizens using regulations and a system of incentives. So by taking advantage of the kindergarten problem, they came up with the idea of designing a little experiment to play at being the government and to try and control the punctuality of parents at will. And this was no convoluted experiment. In fact, the idea was quite simple. All the researchers did was to fine the parents 10 Israeli shekels every time that a parent was late. 10 shekels, which adjusted for today's prices, would be something like $5. Nothing to break the bank, but it was no fun to pay the fine either. Never is. However, there was one important detail. The fines were not implemented in all the daycare centres. Out of a total of 10 daycare centres that participated in the experiment, only 6 randomly selected ones applied the fine system, while the other 4 remained exactly the same as always. The reason is that this way, at the end of the experiment, they could compare the two groups of daycare centres and measure how much the lack of punctuality had varied from one group to the other. In this way, they could regulate the fines and see which was the best option for all. The curious thing is that the researchers could not imagine how the results of a simple experiment would completely revolutionise the economic theories in force to date. And I'm sure that most of you will be surprised by what happened. So the question is, what were those results? Well, check out this graph. As you can see, when the system of fine was applied to parents who arrived late, not only did it not cut their tardiness, but the number of parents arriving late each week actually doubled. Whereas before the experiment, an average of 10 parents were late per week. After the penalty system, there were 20 parents who were late. But, Visualeconomik viewers, it doesn't end there. After 12 weeks of experimentation, the researchers decided to eliminate the system of fines and see if the parents returned to their initial level of tardiness. What happened? Well, everything stayed the same. The fines caused an increase in arriving late, and then after they were removed, the increase was maintained. But now, why did all this happen? What is the reason why parents increased their tardiness when fines were involved? What are the consequences of this effect in politics and in real life? Well, today on Visualeconomik, we will see what is behind this strange phenomenon. So, let's get cracking.
Hidden incentives.
An initial hypothesis to explain why parents started arriving late when the system was established is the theory of moral incentives. You see, until this experiment was conducted, the dominant thinking on how fines affect people's behaviour was known as deterrence theory. This theory argues that after a sanction is imposed for misbehaviour, that misbehaviour diminishes. You know, the kind of punishments our mums have been perfecting for generations. In addition, the deterrence theory argues that the greater the fine, the greater its effect on correcting that behaviour. However, the theory of moral incentives contradicts this theory with a very clear premise. Not everything is about money. Imagine you are one of those parents who's about to be late to pick up your child. You are well aware that classes end at 4 p.m, and that if you were late, you'll be forcing your child's caregiver to stay at work longer than he or she should. So long as you're not a cheeky ratbag, this probably doesn't sit well with you, and you'll feel bad, right? And not only that, the shame and embarrassment of having to come forward and apologise when you know you've inconvenienced someone is not exactly comfortable either. Now, what happens when a fine is imposed to penalise this behaviour? Well, many parents interpret the fine not as a fine, but as a price. After all, if the caregiver has been charging you all morning to be with your child, he or she can stay 10 minutes longer if you compensate them in the form of an additional payment, directly to the individual or to the daycare centre itself. Under this reasoning, making the caregiver stay longer ceases to be a morally reprehensible act and becomes just another service offered by the daycare centre, which is morally acceptable. The key is that for many parents, it is worse to apologise than to simply pay a fine. That is why, when there is a fine, they are less concerned about being late. Of course, if you have been listening closely to the whole explanation, it will seem that there is something quite wrong here. If the theory of moral incentives is true, why is it that when the investigators withdrew the fines, parents did not return to their initial levels of late coming? Well, let's see. At first glance, we could think, that maybe it's just a matter of convenience of becoming accustomed to being late. But that would be too basic an explanation and probably inaccurate. So the researchers proposed a second alternative hypothesis to the theory of moral incentives, the hypothesis of incomplete contracts.
Calling a spade a spade.
A According to the researchers, the contract that parents signed when registering their children for daycare went something like this. In the daycare centre, we will take care of the children after closing time if a parent is late. We will not charge for this extra service, but of course, any lateness on the part of the parents should be an exception and should only be late when strictly necessary. If a parent is very often late, we might take action. Notice that the consequences a parent would suffer for being late were often not at all clear in the contract. Could a child be expelled from daycare if the parent was always late? Or even worse, could social services be called and the parents face legal problems? Whether or not this was the case, the fact is that in the absence of details in the contract, parents preferred to refrain from arriving late and avoid the consequences that the daycare centre could impose in this regard. So what does all this mean? Well, after implementing the fine system, the daycare centres played their hand. The fine served as a kind of messaging from the daycare centres to all the parents. Hey, the worst thing that can happen to you if you are late is that we will charge you $5. No expelling your child or calling the social services. Therefore, this gave parents a sense of relief, and they saw that if they were going to pick up children late, it was no big deal, which fits perfectly with the fact that after the fines were removed, the level of tardiness remained high. All in all, the worst thing that could happen would be for the fines to return. Now, how can the consequences of this experiment be applied to real life? What can we deduce from it? Well, it could be that many crimes committed today were induced precisely by the fines that punish them. Things like DUIs, drug possession, or even stealing. Although Visualeconomik viewers, the truth is that in this respect, the authors are clear. The result of their study does not imply that every time a fine is imposed, the behaviour to be punished will increase. No. What the authors are saying is that not everything is as straightforward as imposing punishments or rewards to determine some people's behaviour. And naturally, there are more factions to take into account than just money. Another thing the researchers point out is that the response to the punishment also has a lot to do with the amount of fine and how quickly it is applied. Surely if they had fined each parent, $500, none of them would ever have been late. For example, Singapore has been obsessed with cleanliness since the 1960s. In 1968, Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew launched the Keep Singapore Clean campaign, which aimed to make Singapore the cleanest and greenest city in Asia. And in 1992, the following thing happened.
Singapore prohibits chewing gum, 3rd of January 1992. The ban has been welcomed in some establishments, but has been deemed drastic and extreme by many citizens. Singapore authorities will force tourists to declare the amount of gum sticks they are carrying, and if they are deemed excessive, they will be confiscated. Fines for violators will be just over $3,000 if it's the first time, or $6,000 for repeat offenders, with the possibility of being sentenced to 2 years in jail.
Evidently faced with such a high fine for chewing gum alone, Singaporeans stopped using chewing gum altogether, and the ban did not have the same effect as the daycare experiment. There is one more conclusion that we can draw from the experiment, and particularly from the problem of moral incentives, which is that with taxes, we could be putting a price on solidarity. I mean, it is possible that in a world without taxes, people would donate more money to charitable causes or to get more involved in altruistic projects, but that the reason that they do not do so is because they think that the taxes they paid already take care of it. An interesting thought, right? However, the final conclusion of the experiment concerns an issue that is very close to our hearts right now. Check this out.
Democrats consider adding carbon tax to budget bill. Momentum for such a levy is growing as a way to address climate change, and economists have long favoured a carbon tax as a straightforward approach to putting a price on the greenhouse gas emissions. Advocates say it would encourage companies and consumers to pollute less.
Could the effects of childcare fines be replicated in anti-pollution taxes? What if environmental taxes were counterproductive? In Colombia, an experiment was carried out in which a piece of forest was given to several farmers to cut down. The only limitation was that if they cut down too many trees, in the following years there would be droughts that would damage the natural environment and cause economic losses for the rest of the population. In any case, the researchers gave the farmers the freedom to cut down as much as they wanted, and the surprise came when they realized that instead of cutting as much as possible and obtaining all possible benefits, the farmers only cut 60% of what they could have cut. Why? Well, because the farmers that were aware that cutting too much would cause serious problems. However, after a few days, the researchers announced to the farmers that a small fine would be introduced for those who cut down trees in excess. So do you know what happened next? The farmers changed tacks and suddenly activated the Homo economus mode. They cut down all the trees in front of them, and many more. Now, does that mean that any climate fine or pollution tax may end up having the same effect? Well, again, not necessarily. The researchers of the Colombian experiment recommended that these types of climate regulations be agreed with the community, that they talk with the farmers to pursue common objectives, and that they apply fines that are designed from the ground up. But now, it's up to you to give your opinion. In what context do you think it is a good or bad idea to use fines or taxes? What additional effects that have not been explained do you think may be behind the daycare experiment? Do you think that controlling the population with incentives is as easy as it seems? You can leave me your answer answers in the comments below. And as always, don't forget that here on Visualeconomik, we release new videos every week. So subscribe to our channel and hit the little bell button down there so you don't miss any of our videos. If you like this video, like it so we know. All the best, and I'll see you next time.